Good morning, everybody. So, wanted to take a look with you at the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim in the laws of Tefillin, just to show you that this is one of these crossover halachos that crosses over from Orach Chaim, which deals with daily life, and Choshen Mishpat, which deals with monetary issues. So, this is in Siman Yud Daled in the Shulchan Aruch. Where the Machaber writes, Mutter litol talis chavero ulevarech aleha. You are allowed to take your friend's talis without his knowledge and to make a bracha on it, uvilvad sheyikapel ota im mitzah mikupelet. But you have to fold it. If you found it folded, you have to fold it when you're done with it. And so we're going to go through a couple of very select commentaries. First of all, in the Sefer Olas Tamid, which is right here, he says, of course we know what's the reason, we learned it yesterday, Mishum de mistama nichale leinish lemevad mitzvah b'mamon shalo, because a person is happy to have a mitzvah done with his property. But he says, V'nire davka lifa'amim, she'ein bo hefsid v'kiloi karna. He says, but it's only on an occasional basis that you're allowed to do this, but not on a daily basis. Avalo bekeva, the kenkas of Hanimuke Yosef. He says, but you're not allowed to, let's say, every day. You're saying to yourself, for 6 months, it's inconvenient for me to buy a new talis, and I know my friend davens at the 8:30 minyan, so I'm going to the 6:30 or the 7:30, so I'll just use his talis for the next 6 months. That you're not allowed to do. It's only if it's an occasional thing. Okay. And the obligation to fold it up, okay, is based on the fact that, yes, it's true, a person is happy for you to do a mitzvah with his property, but he wants it to be preserved in the way that he would want it to be preserved. Okay? So that's logical. And then the Ramah continues. Sorry?
No, just a quick question.
Yeah.
In theory, if it's good on an occasional basis, why would it not be good for 6 months? If the rationale is that a person would be happy that somebody's using their talis for a mitzvah, so what's there doesn't seem to be an explanation why, for 6 months, a year, long term versus an occasional time.
So I would say that number one, it's the wear and tear issue. And then number two, and we're going to look at this later on in just a second when we take a look at the Aruch HaShulchan. I think you'll find that the answer is explained as well. So let's just look at the Ramah first. He says, the Ramah says, V'hu adin b'tfilin. The same halacha applies, that applies to talis, also applies to tefillin. I'm sorry, Siman Yud Daled is not Hilchos tefillin, it's Hilchos tzitzis, excuse me. Okay, aval asur lilmod misfarim shel chaver below da'ato, but you're not allowed to learn from books that belong to your friend without his knowledge. Okay, and like the Mishnah Berurah says, afilu be'akrai ba'alma, even if it's only on an occasional basis and a very casual basis. The chayshinan shema yikra bahen harbe ad sheyitkaru merov hamishmush, and so the Mishnah Berurah says, our concern is that books are more fragile. They're not as steady a state as a talis and tefillin, and we're worried that the pages will tear from the use. And then the Mishnah Berurah writes, "V'ha'olam nohagin kishemotzin siddur tefillah o machzer beveis hakneses." People are very cavalier with this, and when they find a siddur that's owned privately, or a machzer in the shul, shalok chenoso kedei lihispalel bo, that they will take it, even when the siddur doesn't have its own sidurim. If they find the siddur in shul and it seems to belong to a private party, people don't give it a second thought. They will borrow the sefer. Ve'eni yodeya heter lazeh, d'maishna sidur misfarim. Quoting the Pri Megadim, he says, I don't know what the heter for this is. because why should a siddur be any different from any other book? And okay, so again, like the Ramah says, you're not allowed to borrow a sefer without your friend's knowledge. We're worried that you're going to tear it in the course of your study of it. So the Mishnah Berurah is not aware of any heter to borrow someone else's books, to open up someone else's books without their knowledge, and not to just casually borrow their siddur. But okay, so before we get to any further discussions to just justify that practice, I wanted to show you the Aruch HaShulchan, and I think Alan's going to be very happy with the Aruch HaShulchan. Rav Epstein, who lives until the very end of the 19th century, and writes his commentary almost at the same time as the Mishnah Berurah, but as we saw, that certain volumes of the Aruch HaShulchan were published after the Mishnah Berurah. So he writes, Kasvu hatur b'shulchan aruch sif dalid, demutter litol talis chaveru ulevarich aleha. So first he quotes the Shulchan Aruch, that you're allowed to borrow your friend's talis and to make a bracha on it. Uvilvad sheyikapel ota imatza'a mikupelet ad kan l'shana. But the only thing you need to do is to fold it. If you found it folded, you should fold it as well. Mishum devadai nichalei leinish lemevad mitzvah b'mamona. And the reason why you're allowed to borrow this is because we assume that people would love for a mitzvah to be done with their property. Uritzon bal hatalis bekach v'lo kapid. And therefore, the owner of the talis is happy with this. He doesn't mind. V'lachein iyadinan degaver kapdanahu asr litol shalom idaito. And therefore, it all depends on whether, if you know the person. If you know that the person doesn't want people to use his stuff because he's a particularly perhaps fastidious person, or he's a person who's very careful about his stuff, so then and you think that he would not want you to borrow it, then you cannot use this heter. In other words, if this heter is only dispensed for the average person, but if you happen to know that the guy in shul whose talis is in his seat or in his cubby is someone who would not want people to borrow his talis, so then you cannot rely on this heter. V'nira le'anios daiti. And then the Aruch HaShulchan writes, it would seem to me, Av sheraboseinu paskiv hadin hazed de bistama muter likach talis chaver shalom midaito ulihispalol bo mitam devadai nichalei. He says, even though our great sages have already issued this ruling that you can borrow your friend's talis without his knowledge because we assume that he's happy for you to do so, mihu anan chazinan daharbe makpidin bazeh ma'od. Yet, nowadays, he writes, we see that people really aren't happy with this and would not want to lend their talis out. Ubifrat kishetahalitu chadash v'naki, especially when it's a brand new, sparkly new talis with the bling, right? That was a word that was in our Smichas Chaver program in one of the documents that I read, that it has all the bling, right? Especially when the talis is sparkly and new. V'gam yesh b'nei adam she'ein sovlin klal. Sha'adam acher yilbash beged shalahem mitam zeya unikiyut. He says, and we also know that there are people who are what do they call them, neat freaks or clean freaks, that I don't want someone else's sweat and greasy hair oil to get on my talis. That disgusts me. I'm a germaphobe, right? And therefore it seems, in my humble opinion, says the Aruch HaShulchan, that we need to spend a lot of time considering this issue. That's what it means when he says sheyesh lihit yashev b'din zeh. You have to really consider this carefully. And and then he elaborates a little bit, but that's really his conclusion. His conclusion is that this is not such a simple halacha that you can just take liberties with someone else's property. You have to really assess what the person's thinking is, especially when it comes to garments. There are people who just don't feel comfortable when other people put on their clothes. And a tallis is an article of clothing. So you have to really consider it carefully, especially if it's a brand new tallis. Then there may be other factors involved. So the first thing I wanted to show you is that this halacha is very subjective to time, place, culture, and especially the nature of the individual who's involved. Okay? So that's the first thing you should know, is that it's not automatic all the time. I would imagine perhaps in cultures and in societies which are perhaps a little bit more affluent, then people would be more likely to not want people to borrow their stuff. In communities which are less affluent, there's probably a greater likelihood that they don't mind, because no one has such a cool, clean, new tallis, and everyone's stuff is a little bit, worn and torn to begin with. That's the problem of once you become a little bit wealthy, is that you start to fixate on your possessions more than perhaps is healthy. But it all depends upon the culture. Now I want to show you a contrary position from Rav Rabinovich, who is a contemporary poet. He was born in 1962, so he's the same age as many of us, a few years younger, a few years older. And Rav Rabinovich in Piskei Tshuvos paskins as follows. He says, he quotes the Rama, who says that you're not allowed to learn from your friends' books because we're worried that maybe they will tear. And the Mishnah Brura, then he quotes, says, even ba'akroi ba'alma, that even in a very casual, very happenstance fashion, not, and just, even that is not you're supposed to do. And the Mishnah Brura was disturbed why people borrow sidurim when they find them in shul, if it's clear that they belong to a private party. And Rav Rabinovich says as follows: Amnam, l'maisa nira she'ein kepedas hashulchan aruch v'haposkim ela bizmanehem. We touched upon this yesterday. It would seem to me that the Shulchan Aruch and the poskim, like the Mishnah Brura, who are so, concerned that you shouldn't tear your friends' books, that's only in their times. Shelo haya hadafus matzui, when the printing press was not so available, and books were very expensive, and it was difficult to have access to books readily. Ma she'ein kein bizmanenu, shesidr chumash umachzor uchedoime nikdim ba'ad sikum mu'at. He says, but today you can get sidurim and machzorim for a pittance, less man de kapit al zeh, so no one really minds. And I'll go even further. When it comes to a siddur, I can tell you that a lot of times you pick up a siddur at a bar mitzvah or at a wedding, you can pick up a siddur for free. I mean, people give out sidurim today and machzorim today as party favors. Thank God we live in a much more affluent society today. And so, and because printing a book today is so inexpensive, he said, Rav Rabinovich is of the opinion that people really don't mind if you find their siddur in shul. They don't mind if you use it. Uchemochein sha'ar svarim shel anoshim pratiyim hanimtzoim beveis hamedrash o sha'ar mekomos tziburiyim. He says, similarly, other privately owned svarim. Let's say you go to the Beis Medrash and you find a private sefer, and it's on the table or it's on the shelf, or any public area. Asher hadas notzenes lomar shahabe'olim hishirum bekavana ekev ki einam svarim yikarim, where logic dictates, based upon the placement of the book, that you found them there because the owner clearly doesn't have high financial stake involved in this particular book. Meaning that why did the guy bother leaving it in shul or in the Beis Medrash? He left it there because it's not a very valuable item to him. He plans to come back tomorrow. He left his Gemara there because he has a chavrusa there every day. He doesn't want to have to schlep his Gemara. And he knows that it's not such like if the end, what would be the end of the world if the Sefer got lost, so he'll just get another one. And so with that kind of assessment, stama havi kamosha pire she'eno makpid ala iyun b'hem. So it's almost as if it's implied that when a guy leaves a book out in a public area, he doesn't mind that people should look at it. Ba'adaita dahachi mashiram sham, and that's why he left it there. Ach davka la'ayin ba'akrai v'lo b'limud kavua. But he says, but then Rav Rabinovich concludes, but even though I'm giving you a heter to be more liberal about books today than the Shulchan Aruch is, but that's only when you're looking at it in a casual way. In a casual way, right? But not with, learning it every single day and spending an hour on it, and to really get into it, because unless you know that the owner has already donated that sefer that has his name on it for public use, or it could also be that he publicly reveals that he's very happy for people to pour through his books as much as they want. So if a person writes, there used to be a practice. There used to be a practice that in yeshiva, I remember, a guy would write his name in the sefer, and he would also write mutter af beli rishus, mutter la'ayin b'sefer zeh af beli rishus. I give permission for people to look into the sefer even without asking permission. And this way, he would let everyone know that you don't have to worry about that I'm going to get uptight if you look at my sefer. In yeshivas, everyone has in many yeshivas, you have your own desk, or you have your own makom kavua, your own fixed place, and you keep a little stack of books, that you set up in your place. And so it's assumed that the fact that you're leaving them in the base medrash means that other people are free to go if they want to be able to use a book that you have there as a reference. You're more than welcome to. And it's even better if the guy would publicly declare or make it known within the sefer itself that he gives permission for people to go ahead and use it. What I used to do when I was in a very large yeshiva is I wrote in the sefer mutter, but rak b'makomo, right? You're more than welcome to borrow this book, but keep it here. Meaning, I didn't want people to walk off with the book, because what would tend to happen is that people would see a book of mine and they would walk off with it and then forget to put it back, and I'd have to go searching for hours until I found it. So you can make whatever condition you want. It's best if you write it explicitly. The last thing I'll just show you from Rav Rabinovich, he says, V'yesh ladas sha'af ba'ofanim shehitira shimush b'chetzei chavero ekav hasvar denichale lenish lamevad mitzvah b'mamone. He says, I want to just let you know that yes, it's true that we assume that people are happy that others are doing a mitzvah with their property, whether it's learning Torah or you putting on talis and tefillin or whatever it is. But im niskalkel onizak hachefetz afilu ba'oines va'afilu toch kedei shimusho chayav l'shalem. But it's important to know that any damage that occurs even by accident while you're using that object, you have to compensate for it. You have to pay for it. Da'aldas lehafsid mamonu mistamalo amrina nichale lenish lemeved mitzvah b'mamonu. Because that far we're not going to go to assume that people are happy that their property will be damaged in the course of doing a mitzvah. No, that's not true. So when we say that when we assess my thoughts that I'm happy that you borrow my item so that you can do a mitzvah, it's only as long as the item it remains in its current condition. But if you damage the sefer, I do expect you to pay for it. or in some way to compensate me for the loss or the damage or whatever it is. So if you put on my talus and accidentally it gets stuck on the bottom of your, on the one of the legs of the chair, and when you stand up, the talus rips. Yes, I expect you to buy me a new talus, or at least to pay me for whatever the cost of the replacement of this talus would be. Okay, so all right, now we're going to go to Alan Mall for the rebuttal. But I just wanted to let you know that on the one extreme, we see the Aruch HaShulchan says that borrowing talis and tefillin is not a fait accompli, that everyone that in your circle of friends you can say, oh, they'd be more than happy for me to borrow their talis and tefillin. He says, because even in his time at the end of the 19th century, he says there are people who are neat freaks, and they're very particular about who touches their stuff, especially when it comes to an article of clothing where on a hot day you might sweat in the person's talus, especially if the guy puts the talus over his head, and there's going to be, the oil from his hair is going to seep out perhaps onto the talus and so forth. So you have to be very circumspect before you rely on this heter. On the other extreme, we see from Rav Rabinovich when it comes to borrowing books, where the Shulchan Aruch is very machmir. He says that that's not necessarily the case anymore today. He says especially if you find a sefer like a siddur or a chumash, or any other sefer you find out in the shul or the beis medrash that people put out, it's a sign that they really don't mind if other people flip through them. There are reading materials that people bring with them to shul, right? So I know that one guy brings a scholarly journal with him to shul and leaves it in the pews, right where he sits. So the question is, let's say he's on vacation and he's out of town, and you notice that he's left his scholarly journal that's got some interesting articles in it. Can you go ahead and read it? According to Rev Rabinovich, if you're there in shul and you happen to see his sefer, then as long as you put it back where it belongs when you're done with it, it should be perfectly okay. You don't have to be concerned, well, maybe I'm going to tear it. I mean, the whole journal may have cost him $5, $10 to begin with. So you certainly don't have to worry. And if you can say to yourself, if I do end up damaging the book, I'm prepared to pay him for it. That's all. Okay. Questions, comments? Alan, you go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So actually, I was going to, first of all, I wanted to make one point and then ask you a question. You made a comment that, let's say, if you don't want somebody to borrow your talus or whatever, and you pointed out, obviously, for hygienic reasons, I don't think you need to be a germaphobe to feel that way. Just like, if you get back your talus, and it's dirty and has odor to it, etc. I mean, I don't know if I'm speaking alone, but I don't think you have to be a germaphobe. It could just
Well,
be that
you're right. You're right.
unpleasant.
Today our attitudes are different from what they were a century ago.
That I agree with 100%. That if
Yeah.
we were living in the shtetl, probably we wouldn't care about any of these things. But we're a product of the culture that we live in and
Yeah,
grow up in.
listen, we all put on deodorant, we shower
Yeah,
every day. It's a different kind of living, you know.
yeah, I agree. So now the other question I had for you, you made a comment about how we might be more attached to our things than should be, which I understand the point, but I have a question for you from Tanakh, because when you said that, it just, in the whole clothing issue, something popped up from Tanakh that I wanted to bring up and ask you as it relates to this. So if I'm not mistaken, we're told that King David, when he was at the end of his life, he was so cold, right? He couldn't
Yeah,
stay
I knew
warm.
you were going to be quoting that story.
And as far as I know, the rabbis say that there was an early incident in his life when he was hiding in a cave when Shaul HaMelech was trying to kill him and looking for him, that he ripped part of Shaul HaMelech's garment. And if I'm not mistaken, what I've learned is that later in life, the rabbis say, kind of mida keneged mida, that he was not particular with Shaul's cloak, and therefore clothing would, you know, not give him comfort at that part of his life.
And by the way, in that story, what he was trying to do was to teach Shaul that he could have killed him, because he found Shaul sleeping, and what he did was is that he took out his sword and cut off the corner of his coat. And he did it to show him, you see, I could have run you through with the sword,
Right.
and I didn't, so I'm not your enemy. So Chazal, what he did was with intent. It was quite deliberate what he did, but our sages are critical that he showed disregard for another person's possessions. It's a very, very minor kind of infraction, but for a tzaddik of King David's level, even a minor infraction like that, even when you're trying to teach someone a lesson, you know, especially when they're mortal enemies, right? Nonetheless, King David was punished in that when he got older and he tried to cover himself with blankets and stay warm, the blankets would not keep him warm. So, Nebuch, he was forced to get a very beautiful young lady to come into bed with him to keep him warm. A horrible, horrible fate for any old man, as we all know. Yes, but anyway, go ahead, Alan.
No. So that was it. I just want, so obviously, we're not on King David's level, but I assume it's to teach us that the rabbi that I heard gave that drasha basically said that, for example, when you come home and let's say your coat, you should hang up your coat properly. You shouldn't just like throw it on the ground.
Yes, very
Or
much so.
You should conduct yourself in a way that shows grateful, that you're grateful and appreciation, even though it's an inanimate object. So I just wanted your comment, given this whole topic that we're going, considering that.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, this whole idea that if you find your friend's talis folded, permission is granted to borrow it, but you have to fold it when you're done. So in other words, it's showing proper derech eretz to your possessions and to your friend's possessions. And I certainly think that yes, it's true that you have to show because basically what is the attitude? The attitude is, and by the way, in Parshas Vayishlach, which we're going to learn next, not this Shabbos, but the following Shabbos, what does it say? That Yaakov went, he crossed the Yabok River with his entire family, and then he stayed behind, went back for what? So Rashi says he went back for pachim ktanim. He went back for small containers.
His Tupperware.
Right, however you're going to understand that. But he had small earthenware jugs that he had forgotten that he had to go back and get, which when you read it, it seems like almost like it's trivial, right? And Chazal are making a point that it was trivial stuff that he went back for, and that's why he was attacked by the angel. So on the one hand, maybe the one way of reading it is that the reason he was attacked is because he worried too much about trivial stuff. But there's another way of learning it, which is that Yaakov had such an appreciation that everything that he had in his possession, no matter how wealthy he was a gift from Hashem, that he felt it was important for him to retrieve even the smallest of items and not just live like everything was disposable. One of the unfortunate side effects of having such an affluent society, which has the technology to manufacture virtually anything on the fly, is that we view everything as being disposable, whether it's our clothing, our computers. Everything is made to become obsolete. That's one of the reasons why Canada couldn't compete in certain industries, or the U.S. with China, because they manufactured items that may have been of poorer quality, but the public doesn't mind because they're ready to throw it away and buy another, in a year. And Canadian clothing was always known as very, very good quality. Even I remember when I was living in the U.S., you would go, and if you needed especially any kind of winter wear, or if you wanted a fancy suit, and it was made in Canada, so you knew that it was great quality. But at the same time, Oh, there we have Ron Becker here.
Yeah, I proudly advertise that, Rabbi.
Yeah, there you go.
And you know, Canada really does have that reputation, amongst, especially in the U.S. of for high quality manufacturing.
High quality manufacturing, right? But the thing is that we live in such a throwaway society that quality sometimes is lost on the larger public. You know, people who are concerned about quality is a more like a niche kind of. It's not, certainly not the majority of the consumer world.
I guess the Canada Goose Code is an exception, right? And maybe
Yeah,
that's where.
yeah. There are specialty items that people are willing to pay much more, right? That's true. But in general, you know, uh, it's a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing that al pi halacha I can now feel comfortable borrowing someone else's safer, because I don't have to worry that they're going to freak out if if it gets damaged, because they'll say, "What's the big deal?" You know, I'll just go back to Israel's or wherever I bought this, and I'll get another copy, and you'll pay me whenever you have the money. You'll give me the $10 or $20 that it costs. It's not a big deal. Between us, we're friends. But on the other hand, um, we lose the appreciation, like you mentioned, Alan, for the fact that everything that we have in life is a gift from Hashem, and we should not take it for granted. Okay, much more to discuss, but our time is up. So have a great day.